NASCAR got caught in its second scandal of the season, following the Atlanta Cup Series race. But this time, NASCAR has broken its silence and thrown a bombshell on the drivers shortly before the COTA. Way to complicate things, right? Are we on track for the third scandal this weekend? So, this week on Hauler Talk, the Managing Director and Senior Director of Racing Communications returned to explain the contentious decision made during last week's Cup Series race. This week, Managing Director Mike Ford and Senior Director Amanda Ellis spoke about what transpired in Atlanta and the big difference between Saturday night and Sunday. "So, we're talking about it again," Ford explained. "So, we let it go green on Saturday evening in the Xfinity race. Once that happened, a chain of communication really took place between NASCAR competition and the industry on how we should look at the last lap and if there's a wreck." Amanda Ellis provided her opinion on the weekend. She was in race control, watching the Xfinity Series race finish. "Yeah, and I will say, as you mentioned, I was in race control. End of a race moves very quickly," claimed Ellis. "When we had Austin Hill cross the finish line, you knew you had a wreck as well. There's a lot of moving parts that really kick into play and start taking place. We're dispatching equipment, we're also trying to capture the field, you're trying to bring the field down pit road, then you move into a technical inspection. So, there's just a lot of things that are happening in those moments, and honestly, I'm not afraid to admit, I didn't think that last lap wreck was that bad. I recognize watching the replays and kind of seeing some of the vantage points we have in hindsight. I do understand why we feel like we should have thrown the caution, and we said that's on us. But in the first few moments after that, I didn't necessarily think it was that bad because I knew we were able to dispatch the equipment on the backstretch to make sure we got to the drivers and things like that. However, looking at the replays, we now see some other things that we're not comfortable with." Ellis went on to claim that there was a flood of calls, texts, and messages from drivers and teams that followed. Not only the Xfinity Series, but also the Cup Series, were wondering what would happen the next day in their race. The input from drivers, as well as the replays, convinced NASCAR that they had made a mistake. It is good if NASCAR is saying, "We're going to throw the caution for safety. Last lap or not, driver safety has to be a top priority." While it is enjoyable to have Hauler Talk every week, I do have one criticism. This is the second week in a row that NASCAR has acknowledged making a mistake to start the season. Whether a caution was called in the Duel 2 race or not at the Atlanta Xfinity Series event, or calling it during a Cup Series race when it may not have been necessary. I believe that starting the year with Daytona and Atlanta back-to-back is a wise decision. It offers very engaging racing for both casual and new fans. With 2 draft tracks to start the season, consistent officiating is not too much to ask. NASCAR presents compelling reasons. Driver safety is very important. However, just 2 weeks into the year, it appears that a trend is emerging, coming to the right conclusion, but 2 days too late. And now we're prepared for COTA, where unexpected things may occur again. So, will they do things correctly this time? The core question is, when is a last lap wreck sufficient to warrant a race-ending caution? It's a question that has plagued NASCAR's race control throughout the first 2 weeks of the 2025 season. In the first 2 races of the 2025 season, NASCAR's race control has struggled to decide when a wreck warrants a race-ending yellow flag. However, to understand why it has been so difficult to reply, we must go back before this year's Daytona 500 started. NASCAR's sanctioning body has generally given last lap cautions in the case of a major incident, regardless of the circumstances. However, that stance would change after it received criticism at the conclusion of the second dual qualifying race. After some cars collided in the middle of the pack, Austin Cindric and Eric Jones were side by side in what promised to be a photo finish. The field was barely seconds from the finish line, and due to the timing of the caution, Cindric was declared the winner, despite Jones being ahead of him at the finish line. It was a terrible few minutes as Jones, convinced he had won, pumped his fist and parked on the front stretch as Cindric returned to the pits. The question was clear. What difference did that caution make when the accident occurred immediately before the start-finish line? Aside from who won the race, most people agreed that the yellow did not vary much as the pack approached the finish line. Due to mounting criticism, NASCAR acknowledged that the caution call was erroneous and took a more lenient approach to last lap races for the rest of the weekend. This approach amazed and surprised many when the Daytona 500 remained green after all 5 race leaders crashed, spinning furiously in front of the pack on the penultimate lap. NASCAR maintained this position into last weekend's race in Atlanta. allowing the field to race back while many cars collided hard on the backstretch during the Xfinity race. This provoked new criticism, this time from drivers who were outraged that cars were speeding through an accident site, while others who lifted lost multiple positions. NASCAR admits to making a mistake and shifted its position again. If such an incident occurred at the end of the Cup race the next day, they indicated that a caution would be issued. As fate would have it, that is precisely what occurred. Josh Berry spun on the backstretch toward the end of the Cup race, colliding into a number of other cars. NASCAR called a caution, but unfortunately, it denied those watching another historic finish. The leaders were racing 3 wide through the final corner, but the yellow flag prevented a photo finish this time. Fans were understandably furious, and the subject of safety versus entertainment jumped to the forefront of the discussion. The problem they confront is this: issuing the caution will surely impair certain finishes, but not throwing it may compromise the safety of the drivers on the track. And the sanctioning did themselves a favor by changing stances so repeatedly over the previous 2 weeks, causing more confusion and a lack of clarity, regardless of where they ultimately wind up. However, they harmed themselves by overcorrecting from duels to Atlanta. There is no evidence that the caution at the end of the dual qualifying race increased safety. Speaking only about superspeedways, NASCAR should not issue a caution for a wreck that occurs between the exit of Turn 4 and the start-finish line. They should also not compel drivers to floor it during an incident on the backstretch in order to avoid losing many positions and valuable points. A spin in the rear is not a race-ending caution, but the leaders wrecking in front of the field on the backstretch most definitely is, and there is no reason for a yellow until the checkered flag appears. This reflects the finest of both worlds. NASCAR is not alone in its efforts to ensure a green flag finish, often at their own expense. In recent years, the Indianapolis 500 has employed red flags to ensure there are enough laps to complete under green lights, since IndyCar does not have overtime rules. Marcus Ericsson slammed race control, causing a one-lap shootout to decide the 2023 Indy 500, leaving him a sitting duck out front. Of course, Formula One famously broke its own regulations by allowing the 2021 title race in Abu Dhabi to go back green for a one-lap rush to decide the World Championship, resulting in a race finish that people are still talking about. And is there anything else NASCAR could do? Some have proposed allowing last-lap cautions to just push the race into another overtime restart, but I firmly oppose it. NASCAR used such a rule at the 2022 All-Star race, resulting in a questionable caution just as Ryan Blaney was poised to capture the checkered flag. The yellow arrived so late that he felt the race was over and removed his window net. He had to physically hold it up while fending off the field for another restart. Allowing subjective calls at the end feels like closing one Pandora's box only to open another. The truth is that some races will conclude with caution. There is no avoiding it, and yes, it is bad. But NASCAR can definitely handle it better than they have in the last 2 weeks. To be honest, the Cup race in Atlanta was really difficult to govern since the leaders were 3 wide following an accident in the middle of the pack. And, in some cases, there may be another option, a caution that freezes the field behind the race leaders or at the accident scene, allowing those in front to resolve the struggle for the win organically, while cars in 20th do not have to drive through a wreck to finish 15th. And regardless of which path they go, we simply require consistency, which NASCAR has historically lacked when making some of these judgments. Too often we see Elton Sawyer, Senior VP of Competition, discussing race control decisions during a post-race media scrum. Too often, spectators leave race events disappointed and perplexed. While it would be ideal if drivers could avoid colliding with each other one lap before the checkered flag, NASCAR must be better prepared to deal with these incredibly fluid situations. Every collision is different, and they won't always get it right, but NASCAR must be able to make choices on the spot that are acceptable to the majority of drivers and fans. Clear procedures for what is and is not caution-worthy must be developed, and consistency is essential, otherwise they risk losing the trust of those who watch every Sunday.